'Twas they who rode the trackless bush in heat and storm and drought. 'Twas they who heard the master word that called them further out.
They've gathered to honour a man who died more than 80 years ago, and whose name and deeds would have stayed buried with him forever, but for a quirk of fate and some tireless detective work.
A whole lot of luck that this story saw the light of day.
The historic Karrakatta Cemetery in Perth is the final resting place of Wallace Cordwell and his wife Sarah.
They've laid here for the best part of a century in an unmarked grave, and we're here to pay respect to them and the achievements of Wallace in his amazing story as a pioneer in the Australian outback.
But this story really begins on the other side of the continent, on a property called Rich Avon, on the Richardson River near Donald in Victoria's Wimmera region. The starting point of the longest sheep drive in Australian history. In charge for most of it was the then 21-year-old drover, Wallace Cordwell. So Tom, this is the spot.
Yeah, Tim, this is where the sheep started, way back in 1882, and we've got a plaque to commemorate that event. And this was the starting point of that epic journey, which covered 3,500 kilometres.
That scene must have been amazing here.
Yeah, I think if you can imagine, there are no photos, but imagine what it was like with all those sheep. We know there were 5 or 6 men, 2 covered in wagons, 13 horses, sheepdogs, the air of excitement.
Their destination, the Northern Territory, then on the unmapped frontier of European settlement. Tom's great-grandfather and namesake, Thomas Gatthri, a wool trader and prominent pastoralist, bought this property in 1864. In the years following, he amassed a massive pastoral holding and wanted to expand it further.
Well, life works in funny ways. He got a tip-off for this land that was being opened up on the Barkly Tableland, and he went to Adelaide to the auction, put his hand up and ended up with 1.4 million acres, sight unseen. It had been recently surveyed.
Back then, the only way to get livestock there was on foot. This massive undertaking was, by any measure, a giant leap of faith. Beyond the settled districts, they had no map to guide them, and they had to take the punt that at every stage of the journey they would find sufficient water and pasture to sustain them. Before setting off, the expedition assembled here, around Rich Avon's historic woolshed, still in use today by Tom's brother Chris.
Oh, Chris, I know the shed was built in 1860, but I haven't really thought about the design of the roof. What do you know about the design of the roof?
Well, this shed is quite unique in as much as there's 2,000 Murray pine rafters in the roof. They're all pit-sawn timbers, and they've lasted 160 years. And as I say, I don't think there's a shed anywhere in Australia quite like it. And it stood the test of time, and it's certainly going to see me out.
Here in September 1882, the sheep were shorn before their epic journey.
There's 10,000 sheep in one mob, but there are 850 rams in another.
To learn more of this story, we need to travel to Tom's farm in the Southern Grampians in Western Victoria. G'day, Tom.
Welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much. Great to see you.
Yeah, we've got lots to show you today.
Yeah, let's have a look. The family collection. So, Tom, tell me, what is this archive?
Well, it's a whole lot of stuff from our family history, but the real key stuff is the publication of the Drover story in the Stockman's Hall of Fame from December 1991, where the story of the drover is published for the very first time.
All because a young journalist, who later became the Governor-General, rescued Cordwell's first-hand account from the waste paper bin.
He wrote his account of the story in his latter years, sent it to the West Australian, where Sir Paul Hasluck found the manuscript as it was about to be thrown out, unpublished, and he kept it for 60 years before it was submitted to the Hall of Fame, who then published it. Without that, the story would not have been told. We wouldn't have known what he went through on that journey.
And that sets you off on your own journey of discovery.
Well, that was the initial interest, but it wasn't until I combined that with my great-grandfather's memoirs that he published in 1925. He was in his 90s, and he told, obviously, his whole story, but the story that he was most proud of was the stocking of Avon Downs. Whilst he talks about the droving of the sheep, he didn't really know anything about the drive itself. It was Cordwell's words that made the real wow factor of what happened on that journey.
This thrilling discovery inspired Tom to write a book, published to much praise more than a decade later in 2014. Along the way, retracing every step of the epic journey became a big family adventure.
It's been a bit of a marathon because the initial writing of the book started when our children were very young, and research involved very long camping trips and finding all the riverbeds that the sheep crossed over or walked through, and it takes a long time to write a book of a historical nature.
The remoteness, even in a car, you feel the distances and how far he went.
To this day, we still know very little about Wallace Cordwell. No photograph of him has ever come to light. But Tom discovered through a descendant, Jeanette Richards, two other drovers from the Trek, the McCann brothers.
My great-grandfather, John McCann, and his brother Arthur were two of the drovers who joined Wallace Cordwell on the longest drive of sheep in Australian history. It's something that we knew parts of in our family, but Tom's book brought a whole lot of it together for us.
This is one of the few photos of grazier Thomas Gatthri, who frustratingly recorded very little about the droving trip.
There are only fleeting references to the sheep drive. He was more interested in how many left and how many got there.
But we know he favoured tough sheep, able to endure harsh conditions.
He knew he had to breed a sheep that was suitable for the territory. They had to walk long distance and they had to get there for a start, and he used some Bungaree bloodlines to put the leg into them and to give them a little bit more vigour.
And that soon became critical, as did the skill of the McCann brothers.
He did make comment that if it wasn't for those two men, he could have lost all the sheep when they went into New South Wales into drought condition.
As they journeyed north, they encountered ever worsening drought. Cordwell's account is simply harrowing. He wrote, "We were only doing from 2 to 3 miles a day. You could only let them crawl. We would carry sheep from the tail to the head, drop them, and by the time the tail got up, you would have to start over again, carrying. The camp's yards were made of dead sheep, as every drover camping in them would be sure to leave some behind. The next drover who came along would pile them up, and so it would go on from day to day." Cordwell's valiant efforts to save as many sheep as he could was probably because his pay depended on how many sheep made it to the Northern Territory.
I would imagine that Cordwell was paid an incentive per head as an inducement to get as many there as he could.
At Wilcannia, on the Darling River, the emaciated sheep could go no further. Cordwell made a heartbreaking decision.
He slept on it for a while, woke up in the middle of the night and said, "This is hopeless, we can't go on," and as he says, let the sheep go.
When they mustered them a month later, they gathered less than half the original flock.
3,700 ewes and about 475 rams.
They pushed on, Cordwell scouting well ahead, carefully surveying the country for pasture and water. Then their fortunes changed completely.
And when they crossed the Queensland border, the whole conditions changed. There was grass everywhere, and as he says later, once he hit Queensland, he never lost another sheep.
Cordwell blazed a trail, not only for his own team, but for the famous Durack family cattle trek.
Cross tracks with the Duracks at a place called Springvale, which is near the Diamantina National Park, east of Boulia.
They wouldn't have made it without the guidance of our drover.
In December 1883, the droving party and their sheep made it to the southern end of Avon Downs, 3,500 kilometres from where they'd started. And in time, the sheep flourished.
But that sheep flock eventually peaked at about 70,000 sheep. They ran sheep there for nearly 40 years, but in the end, wild dogs and the humidity combined beat them.
This story is quite unique in the history of the whole country, to be honest, because as people forget pretty quickly how important the wool industry was, and it wasn't because of these pioneers that we had an industry that was so successful.
Slowly at first, but with gradually quickening pace, the sheep areas expanded. And now Australia grazes more than 110 million sheep.
Tom Gatthri has celebrated this story in other ways. Like his great-grandfather and namesake, he also runs sheep, as well as making wine from grapes grown on the higher slopes of his Grampians property. The sheep industry and the Northern Territory connection are celebrated on some of the labels.
Various aspects of the book and the sheep industry, and used two old photos, one a very original photo of those sheep arriving at Avon Downs.
Like his ancestor, Tom is also accustomed to adversity. In 2006, severe bushfire ripped through their property. Just after Christmas, bushfire struck again.
A fire came through our farm and burnt 90% of the property. It was an awful day, as bushfire days are. Strong north wind, a lot of stuff out of your control.
The Gatthri's 7,000-strong Corriedale sheep flock survived, but it had to be trucked to emergency pastures, where it stayed for 2 months. Now back home, still in drought, it needs to be contained and fed emergency fodder.
When they're in the feedlot, I sort of think, oh gee, you know, it's not the greatest life, but they actually eat half as much in grain as if they're out walking around, because they're not using any energy.
At last, some much-needed rains are rejuvenating the burnt ground and growing some grass.
You definitely have your ups and downs, and there are times when you think, you know, is it all worth it? And I'm sure he would have felt those emotions too, but he is obviously a really determined character, as my great-grandfather was, as evidenced in his memoirs, where he was just so optimistic, and that optimism and attitude just got him through to the finish line.
Tom's more recent research discovered the unmarked grave of Wallace and Sarah Cordwell, but he could find no descendants, so it fell on him to pay the $2,000 fee, buy the burial plot and commission a headstone.
I decided that a man that's given me so much and has this remarkable story deserves a headstone and to be remembered and respected as a great Australian.
Oh, look, it's almost overwhelming that we've actually managed to get everything lined up. Be here to see the gravestone in real life. Yeah, amazing.
Now Wallace Cordwell's own finish line has been memorialised.
Here's to Wallace and Sarah.
To Wallace and Sarah.
And the pioneering spirit.
In pioneering spirit.
Sarah Gatthri placed some emu feathers from home as well.
We all have stories to tell. This is a particularly special story because the odds of him achieving his goal of getting those sheep to the end point, to Avon Downs in the Northern Territory, is remarkable when you read just excerpts like the fact that other drovers told him to walk away.
I think it's just important that history is recorded, particularly early Australian history. A lot of it is family history, and we do need to pull it together.
Being able to put the headstone there, I think, is the final chapter in my telling of the story. We may not hope to see such men in these degenerate years as those explorers of the bush, the brave old pioneers.